They laughed at her, mocked her clothes, called her names, right outside the courthouse. But seconds later, when the Chief Justice stood up and called her ma'am, every officer in that hallway went silent. Rain hit the courthouse steps like soft bullets. People hurried past, suits, umbrellas, badges, all pretending not to see, but everyone heard. The laughter, the jeers. "Hey lady, this isn't a beauty pageant," one of the officers called out. His voice sliced through the morning air thick with arrogance. Two others chuckled beside him, their hands resting lazily on their belts. At the bottom of the steps stood a black woman in a gray coat, soaked from the rain. She clutched a folder to her chest, trembling not from the cold, but from something deeper. Humiliation. Her name was Elaine Carter. One of the officers leaned closer, smirking. "Court's that way, sweetheart. Unless you're lost again." The other one added, "Maybe she's here to clean up after us." Laughter again. Louder this time, Elaine didn't move. She looked up slowly, her eyes calm but cutting, like steel wrapped in silence. For a brief second, it felt as if the rain itself stopped to listen. "Are you done?" she said quietly. The laughter faltered. "Excuse me?" The officer blinked. "Did you just—" Before he could finish, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Its doors opened in practiced unison, Secret Service-like precision. Two men in dark suits stepped out, umbrellas ready. "Ma'am," one of them said firmly, ignoring the officers completely, "the Chief Justice is waiting for you." The courthouse plaza froze. The laughter died in the officers' throats. Elaine exhaled softly, the kind of breath that comes after holding your pride hostage for too long. She stepped past them, her heels echoing in the rain-soaked silence. "Wait," one officer stammered. "You can't just— Who are you?" Elaine turned just enough for the light to catch her eyes. Her voice was quiet, but it landed like thunder. "Someone you'll be standing for in exactly 5 minutes." And then, she walked inside. The doors closed behind her with a deep, echoing thud. Silence. Then a murmur rippled through the crowd. The officers exchanged nervous glances, suddenly aware of every drop of rain, every bystander watching, every breath they took. Inside the courtroom, the bailiff's voice echoed faintly through the marble hallways. "All rise for the Honorable Justice Elaine Carter." Outside, the same officers who mocked her were still standing. 3 years earlier, Elaine Carter was just another public defender trying to keep her head above water. A single mother. A woman in a system that swallowed voices like hers whole. She worked out of a flickering office on the South Side, the kind that smelled like burnt coffee and stale paper. Her walls were covered in case files no one else wanted. Young men labeled trouble. Mothers accused without evidence. Names the world stopped caring about. But Elaine cared. She always did. Every night she'd walk home past neon signs and half-shuttered stores, her briefcase heavy, her shoes wet from puddles that never seemed to dry. At home, her daughter Naomi, barely 10, would be waiting. Dinner cold, homework spread across the kitchen table. "Mom," Naomi would ask softly, "why do they always look at you like that in court?" Elaine would smile, tired but tender. "Because they see what scares them, baby." A woman who doesn't bow. Still, the toll was brutal. She'd lose sleep over cases where truth wasn't enough. She'd walk into courtrooms where her skin spoke louder than her degrees. Judges who mispronounced her name. Officers who accidentally patted her down twice at security. Every step was a reminder. This world wasn't built for women like her to rise, but she didn't fight for titles. She fought for justice. One morning, she defended a teenager named Marcus Hale, a 17-year-old falsely accused of armed robbery. The evidence was a mess, the witnesses unreliable. But Elaine noticed something no one else did, a time-stamp error on the security footage. Her cross-examination tore the prosecution apart brick by brick until the truth came out. Marcus walked free. After court, Marcus's mother clung to Elaine, sobbing. "You saved my boy," she whispered. "You saved my whole world." Elaine smiled but said nothing, because saving one boy wouldn't stop the machine that crushed hundreds more. Weeks later, an envelope arrived at her office, unmarked. Inside was a letter from the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. He had watched her case, her precision, her composure, her refusal to break. Justice Carter, it read, I've been looking for someone who doesn't just know the law, but believes in it. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a test, until the official call came through. She'd been nominated, and then sworn in as the youngest black woman to serve on the state Supreme Court bench. The same courtroom where officers once questioned her credentials would now echo her gavel. But that morning, on the courthouse steps, the officers didn't know. To them, she was still invisible, still someone to mock. They didn't see the years of scars she'd earned in silence, the hunger she'd turned into strength, the name she carried, Justice Elaine Carter, not given, but built. And as she walked through those marble doors that day, every insult, every slight, every locked stare from the past followed her. But not to break her, to remind her exactly why she was there, because justice wasn't just a title, it was a reckoning. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed like a hive. Word had spread fast. The new Chief Justice was taking the bench today. No one expected her. Elaine arrived early, quiet as always. The marble hallways shimmered under the morning light. Every footstep echoed against pillars built long before women like her were even allowed inside. The same two officers who mocked her yesterday stood by the entrance again. This time, their laughter dimmed when they saw her stride. The navy robe draped over her arm, her ID card pinned at the collar. Their smiles faltered. "Good morning," she said calmly, her voice steady, composed. They glanced at each other, unsure. Ma'am, you're—" "Yes," Elaine interrupted gently. "Chief Justice Carter, and you'll address me as such." The silence that followed was thick. Even the sound of distant heels down the corridor seemed to fade. Inside the courtroom, clerks scrambled, reporters whispered, and prosecutors straightened their ties. The moment she entered, the entire room rose, some out of respect, some out of shock. Elaine sat behind the bench for the first time, the same space where she once stood pleading for fairness. But she wasn't here for revenge. She was here to restore balance. Her first case was symbolic. Marcus Hale, the teenager she'd once defended, was back. Not as a criminal, but as a witness. He'd built a youth justice program in his neighborhood, helping other kids stay out of trouble. His success drew the attention of local authorities, and not all of it good. Some officers had tried to shut him down, calling his work unauthorized. Elaine listened as Marcus spoke nervously from the stand, his voice trembling under the pressure. "I'm not trying to fight the system," he said. "I'm just trying to fix what's broken." Her eyes softened. "And what's broken, Mr. Hale?" He hesitated, then looked straight at the officers who had mocked Elaine just a day before. "The part that forgets we're human." A chill swept through the courtroom. Elaine's gavel hit the desk softly, like punctuation to truth. Later in chambers, she sat alone, files spread before her, sunlight cutting through the blinds. Her reflection in the polished wood looked older, wiser, and tired. This was the moment she'd worked for. But the weight of the title pressed on her shoulders like iron. Being Chief Justice didn't erase the bias. It just changed how it reached her. Whispers from senior judges doubting her temperament. Editorials calling her appointment political. And now, the same officers who mocked her were under review for misconduct. Her secretary entered quietly. "Ma'am, the governor's office called. They'd like you to preside over tomorrow's public ceremony." Elaine sighed softly. "Public?" she repeated, almost to herself. It meant cameras, reporters, the same crowd that once turned away from her. But this time they'd have to look. As she stood by the window, her reflection blurred into the skyline, part of the city that forgot her, yet shaped her. Tomorrow would be her reckoning, not against those officers, but against every voice that ever told her she didn't belong. And deep down, she knew justice wasn't about being feared. It was about being seen. The courthouse steps were flooded with people. Reporters, officers, politicians, all pretending not to watch too closely. The air was heavy, charged, like thunder waiting to break. Elaine stood at the top of the marble stairs in her Chief Justice robe. She looked calm, but her hands trembled slightly inside the folds of the fabric. Down below, the same two officers stood among the crowd, the ones who had laughed, smirked, and mocked her days ago. Their badges glinted under the morning sun, sharp, cold, metallic. The governor stepped up to the podium, his voice booming through the speakers. Today marks a new era for this state's justice system. For the first time in our history, a woman of color takes the highest judicial seat. Applause erupted. Cameras flashed. But Elaine didn't smile. Her eyes found the officers and held them there. When the governor turned to her, she stepped forward to speak. Her heels clicked against the stone, one slow step at a time. Every movement deliberate, grounded, unflinching. Justice, she began softly, her voice echoing over the crowd, isn't about robes or titles or power. The murmurs quieted. It's about how we treat people when we think no one's watching. A ripple passed through the crowd. The officers shifted uncomfortably. She didn't name them. She didn't have to. Her gaze told the story. The humiliation, the silence, the dignity she carried instead of anger. 1 week ago, she continued, her tone steady, I stood right here, not as a judge, not as a leader, just as a woman, tired, waiting, hoping for respect. The audience froze. Reporters leaned in, pens stopped moving. She took a breath. 2 officers mocked me that day. They didn't know who I was, and that's the point. Respect should never depend on status or skin color. A low hum spread through the crowd, part shock, part shame, part awakening. The officers stared at the ground now. One of them clenched his jaw, the other's face flushed red. Elaine's voice softened, but hit harder. Dignity isn't granted by the system. It's the foundation of it. Silence. Pure, heavy silence. Then came a slow clap from somewhere in the back. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire crowd stood, applauding, shouting, filming. But this wasn't about applause. Elaine didn't raise her hands. She didn't bow. She just looked down at the men who once looked down on her. They couldn't meet her eyes. The governor leaned toward her, whispering, Do you want to press charges for misconduct? Elaine shook her head. No, she said quietly. Let them learn from the shame, not the punishment. The cameras zoomed in as her robe fluttered in the wind, sunlight breaking through clouds behind her. For the first time in her life, the world saw her, not as a victim, not even as a symbol, but as justice itself. And just before she turned to go inside, she looked toward the crowd and said one final line. Never underestimate the one you choose to look down on. One day, you might have to stand for them. Gasps, silence, applause, then thunderous respect. The officers remained still, their pride collapsing quietly under the weight of truth. Weeks passed, but people were still talking about that moment. Clips of Elaine's speech flooded the internet. The line, never underestimate the one you choose to look down on, became a rallying cry across social media, replayed millions of times. News anchors called it a turning point in the culture of justice. Young girls watched her speech in classrooms. Law students quoted her words in debates, and those 2 officers were nowhere to be seen in uniform again. But Elaine never gloated. She never spoke of them publicly. Instead, she spent her days visiting community centers, listening to the voices that the system had ignored. She would sit among mothers, students, even former inmates, people who had stories the world rarely listened to. She didn't judge them. She heard them. One afternoon, as she was leaving a youth outreach event, a little girl ran up to her. Her hair was braided neatly. Her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. Ma'am, the girl said shyly, I saw your video. My brother said you're the reason he wants to be a lawyer now. Elaine knelt down, her eyes softening. What's your dream? She asked. The girl smiled. I want to be a judge, like you, but nicer to people. Elaine laughed softly, tears threatening to fall. She touched the girl's shoulder and whispered, Then promise me one thing. Never let anyone tell you who you are. Let your actions speak. As the sun dipped low behind the city courthouse, its golden light spread across the marble steps, the same place where humiliation once broke her heart. Now it was peace that lingered there. Justice had come full circle. Later that evening, as she sat alone in her office, Elaine looked at her reflection in the window, the faint outline of her robe behind her. She whispered almost to herself, "Some people wear badges, others wear courage." Her phone buzzed. A message from the police department. Subject, mandatory training, respect and conduct, led by Chief Justice Elaine Porter. A small, proud smile curved on her lips. Not revenge, not payback. Change. The camera of life zoomed out. The courthouse, once a place of division, now stood taller, prouder. Because one woman, mocked for her skin and gender, chose dignity over anger and grace over vengeance. And in doing so, she reminded an entire nation what real justice looks like. If this story moved you, her voice would echo in the final seconds of the video, share it, because truth always finds a way.